I have to say that I did give a lecture here 2 years ago, so I don't want to cover the entire same territory again, and I will do my best to sort of add some new thoughts and maybe a slightly different take on what I think is useful to think about in terms of graduate education. So I'm talking about changing paradigms, and you'll understand what I mean by that here is that I mean, if you think about probably when we were graduate students and going back into the 20th century, there were certain assumptions about how graduate education worked. There were assumptions about the structures and the roles. The purpose of a graduate degree has been an assumption that's obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but has been changing. The master apprentice model is a paradigm, the assumption being initially that the role of the student, and I'm going to be talking mainly about PhDs, but it goes for masters as well. The assumption is that the student is the apprentice to the master because they are going to be that profession. It was a vocational degree to become a professor. And of course, that's not anymore. So what does that mean for that entire model? Department structures, these are things that I've come across in my decade as dean, and they are useful, but they can also be hindrances. They are paradigms from a different time, a different era. Relationships with other universities is changing. We have tended to be a little bit siloed, especially regarding education. I mean, we've always collaborated in research, but we haven't really collaborated in education. So that's changing. Of course, our relationships with society is a paradigm that, the previous or the next slide, I guess, shows the ivory tower, which is what it used to be, and it's no longer that. Research paradigms, especially disciplinary research, scientific method we didn't question that assumption. That was what research was. Theses are paradigms. Faculty reward criteria. Admissions, who we admit, why we admit. Student role and the environment and their supports have been changing or need to change. And the needed competencies and attributes of our graduates is a paradigm that I don't think many programs have necessarily rethought from the 20th century. So why do we need to change? Well, of course, we have many things are changing. Graduate careers have changed. We're aware of that and have been for quite some time. I've mentioned the relationship of the academy to society and its purpose. I don't think you'll see any strategic plan for a university that doesn't have the word engaged in the title or the description. As I said, the values, what research is for, what it is, how it's defined, what are the outputs, are changing. Professional identities of students, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The ways of knowing in our era of decolonization and expanded thinking, the way we work, the way we think, the way we know are changing. And that's in part due to reconciliation that is happening across at least North America. And then I think a big thing in my books is the complexity and urgency of world's problems, which I think are increasingly increasing, both complexity and urgency. So in terms of, I'm going to just talk about a few of these things. So in terms of changing careers, we did a survey and analysis in 2016 of graduate students or PhD graduates across, we did 3,800 students across the university. Now I know that pathology, the department itself has more recent data, but this is data from 2016. And it's pathology graduates 8 to 11 years out. So we all know that in those early years, there's often postdocs and various other things. So if you look a little bit later, this is what we found out. So just about 13% or so were tenure track faculty. There was a very large, largest percentage was in public and not-for-profits, and those are things like hospitals, research institutes, some organizations and things like that, and then quite a number in private as well. In terms of what they're actually doing in these sectors, just over half were actually doing research. Some of those were also doing teaching. About a quarter were doing management. Some were other professionals. Some were primarily teaching. So these are small numbers. If you only take those numbers, I think it was about 35. But we do have, I think it's fairly consistent across the board. So I don't think these are out of line. In fact, here's the UBC Health Sciences graduate outcomes, PhD outcomes. Generally. And so you can see it's pretty consistent, except for there are fewer tenure track faculty and there are more in the public and not-for-profit. And my guess is that the reason for that is primarily that a lot of our graduates are clinically trained clinicians. So they might find themselves in hospitals and research centers and things like that that aren't necessarily associated with tenure track position. So let's get on to the complexity and urgency of the world's problems. And I discovered these sentences on the pathology graduate program website to just bring home the fact that it's, I realize pathology isn't particularly a program or a field that is out to change climate change or things like that. But every discipline, every higher knowledge, I think, has or could have an impact in society. Of course, pathology is one of those. And in fact, you state that. You state that the results of your research will impact people, communities, and the world. So I think this kind of question is important to ask, even for pathology. And this is I'm putting this book up here because I contributed a chapter, but obviously the title is a bit hyperbolic, but I think it focuses the mind. And I do think it is actually a good framework to think about what doctoral education should be and can be. Not that we're at the end of the world, but we're in a really challenging time. So the way that I've been thinking about it, and which I think is just helpful as a framework, is to consider the times we're in as post-normal. The term was invented in the 1990s around what science looks like in the latter part of the 20th century, and then it was expanded in 2010 to more broadly. And what these individuals have said, and of course, other people put it in different frameworks, but often they say that really the same thing. What we have taken as normal really does not work so well anymore. And here's an example. This is a picture of burning forests in BC. And I think Einstein said something to the effect that the kinds of thinking that led to the problems is not the kinds of thinking that will create solutions. So it's what's normal is not really working anymore. And then here's an example, and these are some of the attributes that are typically thought about in today's world as being particularly critical. The extreme complexity, the interconnectedness of everything. Chaos and volatility, I think you don't have to go far to see that. The sense of uncertainty, things that maybe in the past we've thought as maybe given, certain or not. Things are ambiguous. And I put this COVID-19 causal loop in here. This is a small piece of the COVID-19, just to illustrate how interconnected and complex everything is. COVID is a single little virus, but look what it's affected. It's affected the economics, the health, the environment, human well-being, mental health, everything. And any one intervention in anywhere is going to affect many different things in many parts of our world and society. So, and this is in terms of how we approach these problems. As I just sort of said, they're not solvable by the old ways of thinking. A lot of what I'll say is an oversimplification, and of course we didn't only do this way of thinking, but it needs a higher form, and some have used the term post-formal thinking, which I'll get into a bit. And then here it starts to talk a little bit about what that is, and that it's not a reductive, scientific worldview that everything fits together in a certain way, but rather a synthetic and systemic way of thinking. And the fact that perspectives from so many different places and people and values are needed in addressing anything we do in this world. And here's a little table I drew up, which is, of course, again, very oversimplified, but I think it helps maybe just get everything sort of consistently together. So we've always had, these attributes, interconnectedness and so on, but I think everyone would say that there's been a massive increase. Mode one, knowledge creation, is a term used by McGibbons in the 1990s, I think, and it bespeaks of a type of research that is done in a decontextual. It's done in a lab, not in the space where it will actually be used, and then it's pushed out, and that has not always worked all that well, that model. Rather, what we're shifting to is more contextualized research. So research that's done in the context of the problem. It's iterative, it goes back and forth with the stakeholders and with those who will be using it. As I sort of mentioned, you can't, I don't think anyone would suggest that you can approach in any meaningful way some of the big problems that we have today through a single disciplinary lens. But multiple disciplines and multiple ways of knowing. As I mentioned, also conceptions of knowledge, and this is again an oversimplification, but certainly when I was a graduate student, these were kind of the ways I thought, and I would call them Enlightenment fundamentalists. The Enlightenment brought a lot of good stuff to us, but I have to realize its limitations. So what we would say now is that we have to think holistically. We have to appreciate that there are multiple ways of knowing. Indigenous peoples, we've lived with assumptions for many years, and now we're moving towards a change in understanding of what our relationships with them are, what the ways of knowing. It's affecting everything. It's affecting our research. It's affecting our ethics and our structures. Decolonizing the institution, what does that mean? It's a fascinating time. We've talked about the engaged university. The democratization of science is an interesting thing, or of research. And an example that I think of when I look at this is, when I was a student or early researcher, we talked about if we were looking at human subjects, we would call them human subjects. It's a very hierarchical. Then that changed, that was inappropriate, and they became research participants. Now it's even changing further, and they're called research collaborators. So it's the flattening out of research, and this brings back the importance of multiple perspectives, and the contextualization of the research. We don't just figure it out ourselves and give it off, but we actually engage those whom we are ultimately serving. Post-PhD employers, we know that. Careers, there will be many. And I've seen that even in pathology careers, that they've changed multiple times. It's really quite fascinating. Communication. We have had to, in our PhDs, learn the scholarly literature, but as graduates go out, they will not only need the scholarly literature, but they will be required to do their work as scholars in the world. They will have to be able to do different ways of communicating. And then I've talked about disciplinary and discovery research. Discovery is the classic term for the types of scientific research we're used to. But there will be many other types of scholarly research, including applications, integration of knowledges. That's not really discovery, but it's mixing too and coming up with something new. Ways of thinking, abductive, design, systems thinking are all things that are fairly, are needed in the 21st century, I would say. And then graduate student identity, and by that I mean the values, the strengths, the interests of students. Whereas before, arguably, the 20th century, it was primarily an academic. When I went into graduate school, I loved molecular biology, and that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, and that's all I wanted to do is discover knowledge. It's different nowadays. Well, maybe it always has been different, but it's certainly more visible now that students don't necessarily want to just do disciplinary research all their lives or necessarily become academics. They want to change the world. And I think that's maybe partly this generation particularly, but change agents, to be facilitators, leaders, innovators, communicators. And so these are things that are really integral to these individuals' well-being and individuals' outlook. And I think I can't emphasize enough how important that is to not only well-being, but to the effectiveness of what we do. So if we are motivated and focused on changing the world, to be limited to something that we're not allowed to engage in, we're not going to do as good a job on it. We're not going to be as effective. We have to play to our strengths. And so it's like a fish out of water. And here's a quote from a recent UBC survey of graduate students. And I must admit that I was surprised of the extent that this is still happening. We've been talking about the idea that students go on to different, PhD students in particular, go on to different careers. Sometimes they come in mid-career. And I would have thought that we were beyond this, that students that supervisors can ignore students if they're not interested in the academy or if they don't look like an academic. And I just have to say I was disappointed that this is still an issue. So in terms of actual thinking processes, let me talk about what post-formal thinking is. And I have to say, I'm not an expert. I'm just expressing what others have said that are expert. So Jean Piaget was an innovator in thinking about human intellectual development, and he viewed the utmost of intellectual development. He called it formal thinking, and the individual would be able to think abstractly. They'd be able to use logic in a binary fashion. They'd be able to reason in a scientific method-like way. They'd be able to analyze it, and they'd be able to think reductively, take things down to their core. So those are essential thinking attributes, and they're particularly critical for defined problems. Those are the kinds of thinking that you use. But for ill-defined problems, it's different. And Jan Sinnott and others have talked about post-formal thinking. So in other words, beyond the formal. And this is the ability to take beyond the abstract to the practical, to take multiple logics and perspectives and balance them and be able to combine them and think about them, to be able to tolerate and understand ambiguity, paradox, conflict, and live with those and use them to go forward. Acceptance of uncertainty of knowledge. That's actually something that's important, because so often I think our human brains are passionate about certainty. We seek certainty all the time. And sometimes that is very much to our detriment. If we're looking for a solution, if we're looking for a thing, we want to be certain and we point to that, but actually that's not the best answer. And we have to live with that uncertainty of not knowing. And then just more broadly, lateral thinking, creative thinking, systems thinking are all important. And I should say that these are not just my ideas or Jan Sinnett's ideas. Every major report that's come out in the past few years has said we need these kinds of competencies in various ways and forms. So what does that mean for, I use the word scholar deliberately here. So if you think of our graduates, they are not necessarily academics, but I would say most of them are scholars in the sense that they use their learning, their knowledge to, in a systemic way, to enact change or to discover or to apply knowledge or to integrate knowledge or to teach knowledge. So they are scholars in that way, irrespective of where they happen to work. And so in the 21st century, of course, we still need our grads to be able to discover and critically assess knowledge, to communicate to the peers and ask important questions. But in the 21st century, well, in the careers, and I would say even in the academy, not just careers outside the academy, we need them to be able to mobilize knowledge, to make change happen, to actually shape the world. To integrate ideas from different disciplines and areas, to understand and perceive. And I use the word perceive because it's not just, it's actually seeking it out and recognizing it, not just, sort of being forced upon one. To make sense of wicked problems, the ones that are so ill-defined. Adapt to different environments. I think we all know how important that is. And to communicate diversely with different partners and audience, to understand and apply learning. Many of our grads are teaching, and in any sense, I think we all should know how we learn. And then to be and to develop constructive identities. And so these are scholarly thinking. This is not, I think what I'm trying to keep pressing is that these are not just skills that you learn in a workshop on the weekend. These are fundamental intellectual qualities that requires a motivation to do it, an awareness, and I would say habits of heart and mind. And the reason I used heart in there as well as mind is that if you don't have things like empathy, you're not going to be able to perceive different or appreciate different perspectives. If you don't have a sense of humility, you're not going to be able to do most of these. Certainly, you're not going to be listening to other people and integrating what they say. So it's a very deep, fundamental need, I would say. I mean, I have a big ask of this. And just so that you know that it's not, these are not just about solving the world's wicked problems. This is actually, these kinds of things are in daily life, and I'm sure we all face these as well. And these are some of the job titles of pathology graduates currently. And so just by looking at them, you can see VP of Translational Pharmacology. Think about the breadth of thinking they need for that. Teaching, of course, you need to understand learning. Founder of a startup, scientific director of a national agency, that's the anti-doping, which is fascinating. Managers in industry, and I would say professors as well need, of course, all this thing. So just to say, it's not just the big grand challenges, it really is all ways of working in this complex and interconnected world. So what does that mean for graduate education? I would say that we need to be able to ask questions from different perspectives, not just one and get to the answer. To ideally collaborate across silos, to mobilize knowledge with and for different stakeholders, to think in systems like that COVID map, to understand that when something changes, there are many other things that you have to take into account. To integrate different forms of knowing, and this could be different forms of knowing emotionally, from an Indigenous perspective, different ways of thinking of truth. Designing solutions. That's not something we have necessarily worked hard at graduate education. And then I've used the words discovery, integration, application, and teaching were the terms that were used by Ernest Boyer in the 1980s too. It was for the professoriate that we needed to value all these things. And as I've said, I think these are important enough to be integral to the deepest intellectual development of students, the ways of being a scholar, the ways of doing scholarship, and not an add-on. You know, I think of the other analogies. So, for example, if you're training civil engineers, you don't say, "Well, we're going to teach you 85% of what you need to know. We're going to teach you how to build buildings up to 20 stories. Anything above that, you figure out yourself." Of course, you're going to need it in your work, but we're not going to worry about that. We're not going to create quality assured programming for that. We're not going to assess you on it. Good luck. Of course, we don't do that. And I realize it's not identical, but I think there's an element of that thinking in our current approaches. So the reason I've talked about paradigms is because I think that's a way of looking at it, to say that we are to challenge our own assumptions about the way we do things. And traditional paradigms that work against these kinds of changes include, as I said, the master apprentice, the disciplinarity of our research and our funding. The ways of knowing we're familiar with, the research values and definition, the coursework, the learning outcomes and assessment that we have taken for granted as being what a graduate degree is, and the theses. So to challenge these paradigms, we have done quite a bit over the last decade. I'm in my very last lingering months of my deanship, and and these are just some of the things we've been working on to what we call reimagine graduate education along the lines that I'm talking about. So because we have believed that it is these different ways of knowing and doing research should be integral, it ideally is a part of some kind of assessment and integral to the program, and ideally in the dissertation. If we're saying these forms of research and knowledge mobilization are important, why isn't it part of the key thing that we assess students on? This is what a PhD is about. So we have expanded what dissertations can look like and what they can contain. Obviously, it's the faculty eventually that determine those specifics, but we have just enabled it to be wider. Supervisory committee membership. If we're looking at democratizing science, if we're looking at the importance of multiple perspectives, why can't we have people from outside the academy more often on graduate supervisory committees? Why can't we have Indigenous elders? Why can't we have collaborators in industry and so forth? Dissertation examiners, when we started working on this, we were a bit worried about how examiners would view these. So we modified instructions very broadly just to say, we value all these things, and I hope you can examine them in that lens. We required lay summaries. We launched the Public Scholars Initiative, which I think probably many, if not most of you know. I will talk briefly about a bit later. We and others have created workshops and courses and these kinds of content that I've been talking about. We tracked and surveyed 3,800 alumni and disseminated that broadly, again, as part of to help programs think to realize the extent of diversity that their graduates are doing and what the graduates think is important. Holistic admissions is all part and parcel of this, because if we are narrow in our idea of what constitutes an excellent student or an excellent researcher, then maybe we're missing things. We launched a collaborative interdisciplinary course that's called the Killam Connection. We had a competition across the university. We've just been trying to integrate these ideas in all our support. We had a couple of symposia and public talks, and we're working on something that's going to look like a collaborative PhD. So where students from across disciplines work together on at least parts of their dissertation. So what have others, besides us, what have other programs been doing? And I just think it's helpful to just lay it out there and think about what are the possibilities. And these are just some that I'm aware of. So people have indeed been expanding their research and their dissertations, and I'll give a couple of examples of those. Alternative comprehensive formats. One of the programs, at least one program at UBC, is doing a portfolio as part of their comprehensive. That could be a professional product, could be a research paper, it could be different things. I mentioned diversity of supervisory committees. We're already seeing a lot of these on sitting on committees. We're talking about honorary mentors, and some people are already doing that from outside the academy, and that could be viewed in many different ways or structured in many different ways. I'm very inspired by people that have programs that have listened to their alumni and said, oh, yeah, I hadn't thought that that form of statistical analysis was probably more relevant than maybe what we're teaching here. Experiential projects and courses is an interesting option. I'll give an example of that. Lectures from outside the academy, and there's programs that use a lot of those, some more than others. Curriculum that approaches these kinds of things. Knowledge mobilization grants. There's a number of, I don't know, so not sure if it's programs necessarily, but at least faculties and institutes and things like that will often have knowledge mobilization grants, either for students or for faculty or for teams. And I think that's an interesting way of encouraging that kind of thing. Many have been really digging down and thinking deeply about what learning objectives should be, and articulating that and tracking that, not just putting it on the website and saying, that's it, let's go, but actually tracking those and making sure that they're developed. And I mentioned holistic, a number of people are already well underway in that. So just a couple of examples of places that have gone beyond the university silos, and I just love this example. It's a course that is being participated in by the Sauder School at UBC, but it's a network of about 7 universities that are collaborating on education. And so this particular course, so they call it a virtual global classroom. So this particular course is on urban resilience, and they have students from Pakistan and Nigeria and Sweden and the UK, all learning in the same classroom. And they will each have projects to work on an urban resilience problem with stakeholders in their cities, and come back to the classroom and talk about it. I just thought that was such a wonderful model. I ran across this just the other day. This is a certificate in translational medicine from Virginia Tech. I think I've seen this quite a bit now. This is a concurrent credential. So this is for graduate students, and it's a track that is a particular focus on translational medicine. It involves courses, and you can imagine that it would involve experience as well, not just coursework. And then research theses. I'll talk a little bit about the Public Scholars Initiative. This is initiative, we called it public scholarship because in a very broad term, so it's mutually beneficial partnerships between the university and outside to contribute to the public good. And it is for PhD students. It was started in 2014, who wish to extend their research or mobilize their research beyond the traditional approaches, preferably collaborate with those from outside, but it's not an absolute necessity. And the directed is for tangible public good. And we provide up to 20,000 over 2 years for grants, either for research or for stipends, if for some reason they need those. And then we have a lot of other activities related to the program. So I'm just going to give a few examples, and I apologize. Some of these I think I've talked about before. Sarah Monroe from Interdisciplinary Studies, but also Public Health, looked at vaginal births after cesarean. So she has a background in, I think she was either a midwife or doula. And she saw I think it's well known, but there's a problem of women who have given births by cesarean tend to more often opt for cesareans in their subsequent births, but that's not always the best route for them or more broadly. So she wanted to see first of all, why they were doing this, and second of all, see if she could do something about it. And so when she applied to the PSI, she wanted money to create a website for patients. And she began to realize that was not going to work. That wasn't going to do much of anything. So she instead spent a lot of time and worked very diligently and very systematically with the stakeholders. So the health authorities, this is the Fraser Health Authority, the BC Health, BC government, patients, health providers, and they worked together iteratively on a policy paper that would enable women to be more supported in in vaginal births after their cesareans. And this policy paper was a chapter of her dissertation. And it has since been implemented in Fraser Health. So that was really very inspiring. And I've put some quotes from the external examiners just because that is something that we have been worried about, just what would they think of all this? And except for with one exception of the 100 dissertations that have gone out, only everyone has been very enthusiastic. So novel and commendable approach of integrated knowledge mobilization in a dissertation. Jens had a very interesting path. He was in experimental medicine. He worked on inflammatory bowel disease therapy, so biologics. It was I can't remember, something immunological, something immunological. And he had completed, excellent work, and then he decided, well, I'm curious about the patients. I wonder whether they will be accepting of these, and what is their perception of these kinds of therapies for, would it work for them? And so he decided to switch gears and do actually a patient perspective analysis, and did 2 of his dissertation chapters were on this, and he had to learn really a whole new field of study. So he worked with clinicians and patients and qualitative researchers, and did an excellent study about how this would be perceived. And again, the external examiner was very complimentary, and particularly about the integration of patient perspectives in any kind of therapeutic interventions. And Natasha graduated from reproductive and developmental sciences. She looked at endometriosis pain. And as part of her dissertation, and with PSI money, she created some patient educational materials, animated videos. And she worked with industry and clinicians and patients for that. And again, it was well received. And the videos that she created have had, well, more than that now, over 500,000 views. And so there's a real need for that. Other products and formats that people have done are essays. This was a particularly, I thought, a beautiful scholarly essay on the role of this profession in society. Scholarship of teaching and learning research. So in botany, zoology, otherwise a very science dissertation, but one chapter was a project that was on teaching undergraduates, this kind of thing. Many people have included films now, documentaries and others, public reports, resources, accessible tools, art installation, and not all these are relevant, perhaps for pathology, but you never know. Choose your path format. And then these are different formats. So again, probably not pathology, but people have done poetry and prose. And I put these in italics because they weren't part of the PSI, but nevertheless, they were very intriguing. And this last one was pathology. And I've talked about Gen 1 before, Torsten Nielsen's student. So she, as part of her dissertation, and she was one of the ones that really kind of inspired me to work on this. She worked on she helped develop a not-for-profit quality assurance thing that most of you, or many of you, are probably familiar with, and knowledge mobilization as part of her dissertation. And she ended up working in that area. So just to say that we have evaluated, and I would say it was very positive. The students felt their identities were confirmed and strengthened. They often helped inspire about potential career paths, although we often heard that those that had initially not wanted to work in academia had decided to work in academia because they said, well, you can do this now. We can make this happen in academia. I'm going to go for that. And we have quite a number that have gone into academia. We already have grandchildren in our PSI of former graduates. And then almost everyone said it was important for them to be included in the dissertation. Partly it was just part and parcel of what they did, but also partly because they wanted to be exemplars. They wanted to show the world that this is possible. And often it was the most important thing to them personally, and they wanted to put that out there. Not everyone was supportive. I would say the partners benefited, and the supervisors were generally very happy. They felt the student grew because of doing this. Not everyone took it seriously, but I think we are seeing more acceptance of this generally. So the conclusions were that it's viable. There's been very positive outcomes. The students were generally excited. Many have affirmed, including our president and provost and many others around the world. It's validated students' works and desires. I think it's had, or I'm not sure if that's been the cause, but I am seeing a broader acceptance in the academy. And just some things that I think were known, but I sort of was more aware of, and that is that integrated knowledge application can improve the validity of knowledge. It can prove the relevance of it in its iterative way of approaching knowledge creation. It's often an ethical, or effective communication with stakeholders is not often an ethical issue. In other words, if you're doing research with a group, you have to be able to communicate to ensure that they understand what's been going on. And that's often just dismissed as not important, but it's a skill. It can take more time. And I don't want to take too long on this, just to say that when I was president of CAGS, we did a 2-year consultation across the country on these questions. And because we wanted to know, is this generally acceptable in the broader academy? And the answer was yes. Students were the most enthusiastic, then graduate deans, and then faculty. And I think it's probably continuing to change, and I won't go into all these other than to say And this report is publicly available, so you can look at it. But basically the same things that I've been saying. And I think the point is that, or a point is that it's not enough to think about education. We have to think about faculty. So this is my, I think, just about my last slide. Coming back to these paradigms. And I have been thinking about the fact that pathology is undergoing strategic planning in its graduate education, which I've been somewhat involved with. And just some thoughts, really more for you than ideas from me. It's really things that you might be worthwhile thinking about. I shouldn't call it you and me because I am a member, but you know what I mean. So the purpose of the degree, how is it changing? What is it how is it different than it was 10 years ago? What does that mean for the program? The master apprentice model is a tough one because, you know, in science particularly, students do the work of their supervisors. So how can we challenge that paradigm in some fashion? We're not going to slash it because it's still useful and important. But who else could contribute to mentorship? Who could be mentors in some fashion or another? What about cross-department? So I know the Faculty of Medicine has been talking about this, maybe, you know, working together to streamline. I don't know where that is precisely, but might there be opportunities to, as a way of enlarging the possibilities of education without necessarily taxing only the internal group? As I said, you know, I just love that paradigm that Sauter used. Is there anything like that? Where else in the world are people doing really, really interesting things that we could collaborate on to offer educational resources? If we are truly committed to helping society, I mean, ultimately our research, we hope will eventually, but is there something that we can think about right now, disseminating possibilities for mobilization, even just learning how to do that? For research, I mean, for graduate research, the skies are open. And this is something I wondered about. It's not, you know, I think the sciences in general, it's harder to imagine broadening that, but maybe one chapter. What about one chapter that looks at a clinical interface problem, or even if it's just an essay, or even better yet, a project, but some interface with the clinical environment where that might not be otherwise possible. Teaching, many are teachers, and how do you teach pathology? How do you teach molecular biology? And this is, I know it's not solely up to the department, but is there a way that we can more fulsomely value things like impact and supervision? Admissions, you know, I honestly haven't been involved in pathology admissions, but I know a lot of science ones look at, you know, it's really just the supervisor that makes the decision. Basically, you look at the transcript and you look at the, you know, research papers that they may have done, and maybe you ask some references. Were they good researchers? Well, those are all important, but what about flexibility in thinking? What about creativity? What about broader experience? What about resilience? How do we tease those out and think about them and contextualize background? I'm particularly thinking about EDI issues here. If we only look at, you know, they'd have to have done an honors project, they'd have to have done, you know, a research summer job. Well, maybe some individuals didn't have the opportunity to do that. Are we considering that? Are we looking at their backgrounds and things that might have influenced what experience they have had? Student role and environment. I know the Faculty of Medicine is working on a project on healthy environments in labs. And I don't know what precise role the pathology department is playing in that, but that seems like a very promising thing to think about. Creative supervision practices. I'm sure I know there are some supervisors out there that are just full of ideas about how to support students. Student grants. I don't know if there's money, but that would be pretty cool. CIHR has dissemination grants that students can apply for. Maybe that's something to promote. What about those competencies? If we need to be able to communicate broadly, could that be part of, I don't know about Path 535. When I was teaching it, it was only scholarly, but maybe that could be something more than just a scholarly seminar that they have to give. Is there a way to integrate fields and ideas? Would a learning outcome be appreciate the role of pathology in healthcare? I don't know. If it is, how would we do that? And so I've come to the end, and I'm just coming back to this overblown title, just to say that I feel strongly that we do have a responsibility. This isn't a nice to have, this is a responsibility we have in today's world to respond to these issues, whatever they are, and find ways to support our best minds to lead us into a better future than we've had. Some references, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Susan, for the very inspiring talk. And as our department going through this strategic planning process, we are reimagining how a top pathology and laboratory medicine department should look like. So the question we were asking, what are the key elements that makes a excellent top department in the world? But your inspiring questions actually, because graduate program is in the front and the center of our education and actually research productivity as well. So and those deeper questions you asked is definitely give us a window of reimagining, rethinking how the top graduate program should look like. I saw there are 43 attendees, so they are all leaders in the not 41 leaders in education, and there's lots of talents actually in the audience as well. So eager to hear you guys' comments and questions about how a top world-class or world-leading graduate program should look like. That's what our goals. And I thought that David has his hands up first. David, please.
Yeah, so thank you, Susan. That was thought-provoking and really brilliant presentation. If we were able to transform graduate education to be much more centered on a broader kind of concept of kind of learning and scholarship, do we have to break the connection between graduate students and specific CIHR grants? I know that's an overly simplified way to look at it, but if a PI writes a grant and says it's funding this student, and then they have to deliver on the grant, and then perhaps the student is just too tied to that process or work clock, which may not be the same as their educational experience, which they deserve.
That's such a good question, David, and I wish I had a really good answer for you. It keeps me up at night. I think there's baby steps. I think, there's people in this room that have made things happen apart from, I'm looking at you, Torsten, if he's still there, that have made things happen apart from the grant that they need. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. Another thing is maybe those grants could look a bit different.
Yeah, that's absolutely an option. I have to run to a student committee meeting now, but okay. I'm going to just sneak another quick question. If we're going to transform graduate education at UBC, are every department having its own program? Is that an obstacle or an asset as we move forward?
A very good question as well. And I think it could be viewed as both. I mean, I think there's value in having a smallish cohort rather than a massive thing. but the silos exist, and maybe there's ways to break those silos rather than merge.
Thank you.
Suzanne?
Thank you, Dr. Gao, and thank you, Susan. That was really thought-provoking, as I thought as well. We have a lot of PhDs in our department at Children's and Women's doing genome diagnostics, microbiology. They do biochemistry, of course, and newborn screening, prenatal. So we have a lot of PhDs in our department. There is a huge shortage of technologists right now, and they don't have really time for innovation in the laboratory, which is an ongoing issue. We recently hired we tried to hire somebody as a validation specialist with a master's degree, in the hope that this person could help us with some validation of new tests. The problem with hiring those people was that they really have no experience in clinical, in this case, biochemistry, which makes it a bit more difficult. But it would be great if there is an opportunity for some graduate students to be trained in kind of applications into the clinical labs, so that they can be used for future validation specialists. And
That's
also,
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, and then the other part is like the career path of certification programs that are there for the biochemists and the genome diagnostic molecular people. Does that get any attention in the graduates?
For the latter question, that's not our domain, so it hasn't been a focus. For the earlier question about finding people who can validate, that's a really interesting question. I don't know the breadth of need for that. I mean, I know you're experiencing, I don't know. So there's several things to think about. One is, of course, you can train master's or PhD within the department. You've got the expertise, you can do that. But there's also maybe it's worth thinking about a different master's degree. I mean, if there really is a need for that, maybe that's a good master's degree.
I think there is a need for that.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen quite a few different types of masters in pathology programs.
Yeah.
Either translational or, sort of more clinically oriented. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's not a question I can answer, but I think it's something to think about.
Yeah, because often you need somebody with a bit more independence and thinking ability compared to BCIT technologists versus.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
You don't have time to use the medical staff for that often either.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Anyway, stop.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions, comments?
Well, my inbox is always open if you want to write me with any thoughts or questions or data, support, resources. Very, very happy to help whoever would like to move on this.
Helen put in the chat that she has to go to another
meeting.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Susan, for the excellent talk. Very inspiring. Well, thank everybody for attending. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.